Now that we have our connection string and configuration in place, let's go back to the command line where I want to try this operation again, .NET EF DB context info. I'll do that on a clear screen. And what we're going to discover is that I still have an error. And here's why. What we're trying to do is work with the DB context and work with this project ode2foo.data. And when I run the command .NET EF DB context info, the only information the entity framework has available to it is the information that is in this project ode2foo.data. But ode2foo.data does not contain the startup configuration, configure services, that's over here in the web project. And ode2foo.data does not have appsettings.json, which includes the connection string. And this is just one of the situations that you're going to face if you separate your data access components and your DB contexts from the rest of the application. But it's not a problem. There's actually several different ways to solve this error that we're seeing. One approach is to add a class to my ode2foo.data project that implements the iDesignTime DB context factory of ode2foo DB context. Now we've seen this term design time on a few occasions in this module. And when the entity framework is talking about design time, it's really talking about now, compile time. That period of time when I'm developing and designing and before I get into production. And what a class that implements iDesignTime DB context factory would do is provide all the information that the entity framework would need to spin up a DB context and have it connect to a real database. In other words, iDesignTime DB context needs to specify a database provider, like we do here with Use SQL Server, and then provide a connection string. And the idea is that particular class will only do this during design time. We'll use something completely different perhaps at runtime. Another way to solve this problem is to simply tell the entity framework tools, look, I'm working with this project, ode2foo.data, but my startup project that configures all my services and my database providers and my connection strings, it's over here in another folder. So why don't you use that to spin up the environment and then start doing work with a real DB context? Let's try that. What I want to do is execute .NET EF DB context info again, but this time add a -s parameter, which is short for startup project. And my startup project is back up one folder. We will go into the ode2foo folder and specify ode2foo.csproj. And now when I run this command, the entity framework should find enough information to come back and give me more info about my DB context. So now it can tell me that when I'm using the ode2foo DB context, I'll be using Microsoft SQL Server with a database named ode2foo. And the specific SQL server I'm using is LocalDB MS SQL LocalDB. So now the entity framework is working. And now what I want to do is use migrations. Migrations are all about keeping a database schema in sync with the models in my application code. So right now I have a DB context that wants to store restaurant information. So what I need is a migration that will create a database schema that allows me to store restaurant information. And then perhaps later, I'll add another class for invoices, or I'll add a few additional properties to that restaurant class. At that point, again, I'll need to migrate my database schema so it keeps in sync with the information that I want to store. I'll need to migrate my database schema to keep it in sync with the information that I want to store as defined by my C# classes. So again, at that point, I could add another migration. So every time I make a change to one of my models, my C# objects that I'm using to store information into the database, what most people would call entities. Anytime I make a change to my entities, I can run these entity framework migrations to create the schema changes that I can apply to my database. So here's how this works. We're going to add our first migration. I'm going to say .NET EF migrations. You'll notice what I can do is add, list, remove, or script a migration. What we want to do right now is add a new migration, but notice you can also generate a SQL script if you want to perform your migrations using SQL. But I'm going to do .NET EF migrations. I want to add a migration. I now need to provide a parameter that is the name of this migration. Let's just call it the initial create, because this is our first migration. And once again, I need to specify my startup project so that the entity framework has a database that it can look at to say, oh, this database doesn't exist. I need to create a migration that includes everything. So now when I execute this command, what this command will do is add C# code into my project that describes the type of database schema changes that need to be applied. So this command executed successfully. Let's come back into Visual Studio. What I want to do is look inside of my ode2foo.data project and I can now see a migrations folder. There's a few different files in here, which are mostly just the entity framework doing some bookkeeping. The most interesting file here is the initial create file. So that's the name that we gave our migration. And in here, we can see that the entity framework created some C# code that invokes an API on this object migration builder that will do things like create new tables. In this case, the entity framework sees that I have a class called restaurants, and I'm using that in a DB set. So it's going to create a table named restaurants. And this table is going to have columns that match the names of the properties that are in my restaurant. So my restaurant C# class has ID, name, location, and cuisine properties. Therefore, my table has ID, name, location, and cuisine columns. Notice the types of the columns will match the types of my properties. And the entity framework is even looking at my data annotations to see that, oh, the name of a restaurant should have a maximum length of 80. And it shouldn't be nullable. It's a required field in this application. So we won't make that a nullable column. There's also APIs available inside of here to create indexes and also to execute arbitrary SQL. But what I want to do next is show you how you can use the .NET EF tool to update a database with this migration that we just created. Let's do that next.